Hello, and welcome to another episode of News from the Gelding. Okay, sorry I wasn't here last week, but I didn't really have anything to say. I haven't got that much to say this time, although it's slightly more than last week, so let's get going. I've prepared a little bit I'm going to talk about in terms of fantasy writing. I'll start off with that. Later on, it's going to be my general news roundup with the return of Slug news, although the slugs in question are not the ones invading our house, but the house of one of my readers. Exciting stuff. Okay, so first thing I'm going to talk about is this idea in terms of fantasy writing, where you have a character from our world who is somehow transported to another. Now, this is my favourite form of fantasy, personally. I really like I think it frames fantasy better when you have a direct comparison to reality. Books like Clive Barker's Imagica. Another example is John Norman's Gore series, which isn't really my cup of tea, but that deals with someone from our world going into another. And then there's the Thomas Covenant series. These all, in various ways, deal with the idea of going from our world to another. Now, the problem with that idea is that if you run with the typical hero-based fantasy trope, you're faced with the problem that you take a normal person, put them in a fantasy world, and expect them to cope. So if we take the Thomas Covenant series of books, we've got the main character Thomas in those. Wait a minute, who are they by? I can never remember. I'll write it on the thing because I can't see it on my bookshelf now. I always forget authors' names. Anyway, he's suffering from leprosy and finds himself into another world, and he is a very bitter man. He doesn't believe that what's happening is actually happening, is perhaps psychosis. Very similar to my own idea in my book, but different. But his participation in the world is grudging at best. But I think his progression through the story is quite believable. And I've tried to make mine similar in that my character James he isn't a very confident person. He's self-deprecating, fairly miserable chap, really. But like the Thomas Covenant character, he doesn't really believe that what's happening is really happening. Again, he thinks it's a delusion, although that idea does change and he starts believing it. What I didn't want was my character to, a few chapters in, pick up a sword and be able to use it. Now, this is a trope that I absolutely hate, and we'll go back to John Norman's books. His character, I think the first chapter, goes from being in our world, gets zapped into another world by a UFO of all things, and within a couple of chapters he's got a sword and he's slaying things left, right and centre, as far as I can remember. And whilst it gets you into the action very quickly, it's not very realistic. And like all good, so for the horror genre, for that to be good, you have to have a certain baseline of reality to work from to make the suspension of disbelief possible. It has to have a grounding, and that's what I like when fantasy of this nature is dealt with, it needs to have a baseline of reality. John Norman's books, they just go off. I think by the third, I think I read 3 books in. By then, they've forgotten, the writer's forgotten entirely the idea that this person's from our world and he's just there merrily going about his way. I don't even know why it was. I suppose that was the thing that kicked the stories off, and then afterwards is more interested in the stories themselves, which is fair enough. But so if we take, I'll just take one example of a film I just wrote down off the top of my head. What is it? Last Samurai, I think it's called, with Tom Cruise. Similar thing, really. A man from, what is it, American Army or something, I can't even remember, but he through a few training montages becomes a samurai warrior. Now that kind of thing I don't have any time for, really. I quite like the film, to be fair, but you had to suspend disbelief entirely for that to work. But so what are the problems of not going down that rabbit hole of superpowers being instantly attained is that you run the risk of it being quite boring otherwise. And that was something I was worried about with my own book, because largely very little is done by the main character James in the first book. He has one brief episode where he uses power of some kind. He doesn't really know what's going on. Other than that, everything else extraordinary to the world and happening within the world happens externally. Other people, other creatures, things like that. But in the second book, I'm trying to get him more involved because he is perhaps a magician. So I've had to start introducing the possibility that he can do things and also wield a sword. Now, the way I'm circumventing his lack of knowledge in terms of how a sword might be used is I'm having the sword as a kind of it's enchanted in a certain way, and so when he is involved in a fight, the sword guides his arm. And I'm reminded of, if anyone's read Raymond E. Feist's Magician, you know of Thomas, I think it was. He finds this enchanted armor and suddenly becomes this badass elven warrior thing. That's another way around it. Mine's slightly more subtle, but it allows James to get into the mix on occasion, if but reluctantly, and not really knowing what he's doing. But that's the way I've got around that problem at the moment. I did consider the idea of there being a training session at some point, in the same way that it was used in with Tom Cruise in Last Samurai, but it would have slowed things down. And because my story is largely about a journey, I couldn't have him practicing swordplay along the way within a space of weeks, becoming able to slay creatures willy-nilly. Just couldn't happen. So took that out of it. Anyway, what do you think, if you're a reader of fantasy yourself, what do you think of this idea, or the trope of a hero that's largely acquiring skills out of thin air? Do you like that? Is it something that bothers you when it happens, or do you just get on with the story and enjoy it? I can go either way, I suppose. I mean, some of the John Norman books I got after he's killed his first few people, I was like, well, fair enough, he can do that. But but I quickly tired of those books. If you've read them yourself, they're fairly. I'm putting down another book here, but if you read them, you'll see there are some issues there in terms of slavery of women, which isn't always a nice thing. Anyway, well, I wrote some more notes. I think that's dealt with that okay. Doodle-doodle-doo. Right, let's get down to the other news. How's everyone doing? I think this is day 34 or something like that for our lockdown. I've done 2 days of work this week. I've been called back to work for a little bit. I suppose you could say I'm being considered a key worker, but nothing like the nurses and everyone the carers involved in treating the virus and caring for patients. But so the school I work for is a school for children with special needs, and some of them are being allowed back just to aid their usual lives. So I've had to go back on a limited basis, driving the child to school, which I absolutely loved, actually. It's just great to have a slice of normality imposed on these days that otherwise just bleed into each other. And driving, I just love driving anyway, and the roads are so empty that it makes it an absolute joy. Okay, so yeah, back to work. I think I'll be doing the same run again next week. I'm still doing the gaming channel. I've done 3 games now. I'm trying to practice some other ones to include on the next one, but the games I'm trying to play are very hard. And now I'm 40 years old, my reactions appear to be suffering. So it's taken me a little longer. But these games are quite hard. And the thing is, with the older games, especially the 8-bit generation of games, they were very, very hard. So it's not a matter of just picking up and being able to play through it the way games hold your hand through them these days. These were brutal beasts that had to be tamed by putting hours and hours of work into them, which is what I'm doing. Total waste of time, but I'm enjoying it. Okay, so what else? Vanessa's hair required cutting, so yesterday I cut it. As you can see, this is the pose I would use for my new salon, were it to come into effect. It was quite stressful, I would say that. I mean, I only took off 2 inches or so all the way around, but I was using a pair of scissors that I normally use for cutting paper, so it don't really cut the mustard. But yeah, it worked. She's threatening to do mine next, which is, well, it's fair enough. I mean, it does need to do it. You know, I don't really care the way I look anyway. So yeah, she might have a go at that soon. So we'll see how that turns out. Okay, so that's that. What else is there? Okay, let's go for Slug news. So, dear couple my friend from university, Dan, and his partner Zara, they've been sending me some photos recently. Photos of infestations. They have also been invaded by slugs. Now, these specimens are quite nice looking, I would say. Not the horrible beasts that we've had. They're not very pleasant, obviously, but I think it's the way the light hits them. There's a certain luminous quality to these examples. They look clean, but they are probably crawling in mites, and you don't want them licking your cutlery. But anyway, it doesn't stop there. They've also been getting woodlice. I always called them cheeky pigs, but anyway, they get those. Don't have them in our place, but who knows? Oh, there's a bee on the floor. I think it's a dead bee. I'll go and get it a minute. Is it a bee? Yeah. Oh dear. Let's have a look here. Yeah, it's dead. Oh dear. Right, let's pick him up. Oh shit! Oh, still alive. We'll leave him there. He's just sleeping. I'll set him free in a minute. Okay, so there we are. That's the end of Slug News for another week. Thank you, Dan and Sarah, for those images. I hope you managed to stop them coming in now. Okay, right, let's stop it there before it goes on too long. I hope everyone's fine. Take care of yourselves and each other. And hopefully I'll see you next week if I've got anything to say. If not, you won't see me. But pop over to the gaming channel if you want to see me bumble for another game. All that said, all that remains is cheerio!